Welcome to Coffee and Coaching with Caryn. Grab your favorite mug, sit back, and enjoy. Now here's your host, Caryn Fitzgerald.
Good morning, everybody. This is Caryn Fitzgerald. This is Coffee and Coaching with Caryn. And my guest this morning, I am very excited to hear and learn with everybody today because my guest this is a topic I have not had much experience learning about. So Allison Stieger is here with me, and she is a mythologist, an author, lecturer, and workshop leader. She's committed to using her deep understanding of the world's sacred stories to find ways to make modern life more creative, meaningful, and fulfilled. And since 2004, she has taught myth to a variety of audiences, including writers, yoga teacher trainees, and preschool to middle school age kids. She also believes that each person has something unique to offer, some fresh perspective on life, and wisdom that only they can share based on their life experiences and the lessons they've learned along the way. Allison, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me today.
Oh, I am super excited. Myth is just something I am not, I'll out myself. I'm not that very familiar with it. I mean, you and I have chatted just a little bit offline. So I know just a bit, but would you first of all, share a little bit about yourself? The big question is, what is myth?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, I've been studying mythology since I was a kid, but more specifically for about the last 15 years. And I was always a writer, and I grew up writing and reading, and I love literature. And I discovered myth as a way of studying story about 15 years ago, and I got really excited about it because we have all of these stories, and some of them are well known, and some of them are not so well known. And they hold so much of the world's wisdom in them. And because they're not really studied in any kind of traditional way in our culture, there's all this hidden treasures of wisdom in them. And I have had the best time over the last 10 or 15 years studying them and learning what I could from them and bringing that wisdom back out into the world in a way that it's not really being done now. Because I think that most people, they study mythology in their ninth grade English class, and then they never really think about it again. And maybe if they think about myth, they think about Apollo or Zeus or the Greeks, and there's just so much more out there in the world culture of myth, from the Aboriginal Australians to the Inuit to Africa. I mean, there's just so many wonderful stories that are available to us as human beings that we can learn from, and not very many people are looking at that. So what I love to do is bring that wisdom out into culture as much as I can and look at how it can apply to our modern lives now and what it can bring to us now as modern human beings, which is a great deal. That's what excites me about it. And really what myth is just ancient stories that people told in order to understand the world around them in the ancient world. So we've got concerns around stories about war and love and fertility and just so many things, and they still have things in them that can speak to us in our lives now because we still deal with many of the same issues as human beings that ancient people did. So we have all these wonderful ancient stories that we can look to now as human beings and with wisdom that's been around for a really long time. So that's what I find exciting about myths, and I hope to share with people.
Wonderful. Would you give us an example? I mean, you're a storyteller in some aspects. So would you tell us a short myth, give us something so that people can one that most of us would be familiar with?
Sure. Well, okay, so most people are familiar at least with the Greek and the Roman myths, right?
Absolutely.
And one of the things that I've been doing specifically with this material lately is I'm very interested in understanding how myths can inform our creative lives and how we can live more creatively through what we can learn from myths. I'm as I said, first, a fiction writer, and when I started studying myth, I wanted to understand what myth had to offer me as far as my creative life was concerned. And I quickly realized that because early people were very concerned with fertility, and I'm sure that you can understand, early people were wanting to make sure that their crops stayed alive, that their animals stayed alive, and that their children stayed alive. So we have a lot of stories about fertility goddesses and stories around how to kind of make sure that fertility is happening. So we have Demeter, who's the Greek goddess of grain and growing, and any kind of fertility around anything like that. And she has her daughter Persephone. And I think that Are you familiar with the story of Demeter and Persephone?
I am not. I'm learning as we go. Okay. I love this.
Okay. Well, I mean, I never know exactly what people know about it. And so Demeter was the goddess of grains, growing crops and things like that. And her daughter was the goddess of spring. And what we have is this wonderful story that's not only about why the seasons exist the way that they do, but it's also about how mothers and daughters separate from each other when the daughter becomes an adult. So you've got this thing that is in there that is still about things that happen to people today when their children get older and how they process emotionally that separation from with the child being very close to the mother and then going older and having to leave the home. Persephone was the goddess of spring, as I mentioned, and she was picking flowers one day, and we have also the other character of the story is the god of the underworld, Hades. And he comes up from the underworld, from under the ground, and he abducts Persephone, and he takes her back down into the underworld. And he wants to marry her. She's going to be his wife. But no one knows what happened to Persephone. No one witnessed this, really. So Demeter, when she realizes that her daughter has disappeared, she is incredibly grief-stricken and starts wandering the world looking for her daughter. Because she's the goddess of fertility, of crops and things, because she's so grief-stricken, nothing can survive. So we've got none of the crops are surviving, none of the animals are being able to give birth to their children and all of those things. And what ends up happening is that because there's no crops and no animals, the gods are not being sacrificed to, which is how they were honored in ancient Greece. So eventually Zeus notices that something is wrong, and he's the king of the gods, right? And he pleads with her to, restore her powers because she's stopped doing her job, basically. And she finally comes to understand what happened to Persephone. And she's so angry that her daughter was taken from her that she refuses to comply with Zeus's request. They are still having this problem because the gods are not being sacrificed to. So eventually they create a compromise, and they asked Persephone to be brought back. But while Persephone was in the underworld, she ate 6 pomegranate seeds and because she ate the food of the underworld, it became part of who she was. And so we have her coming out of the underworld for half of the year and going back down into the underworld. So she's dividing her year between the underworld and being in the upper world with her mother. And this is why we have seasons. This is the explanation for why everything dies in the winter, because Demeter is so sad and grieving for her daughter's absence. So what you've got going on here is you've got the surface story that I've just described to you, and that's fine to a point. But then this is what I do as a mythologist, is I want to look at the story and understand exactly what's going on from a psychological perspective. What does this tell us about what it means to be a human being? And to me, this is about that process of having to let go of your child when they become an adult, because she's getting married. Her daughter's getting married and leaving. Demeter has to deal with this separation of the child, right? So this is an example, I would say, of what we can do with myth, is you can kind of look at the surface of the story and then sit with it a little bit, and it'll start to provide insights for you about things that are true for human beings. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes a lot of sense. So what would be the difference between a myth and what we would call a modern-day fairy tale or a fable? What would be the difference? Is there a way that we can differentiate, or do they all kind of blend together?
Well, I mean, they are different. They are very different. Myths are usually considered to be sacred texts. For example, many of the stories that we have that are considered myths are like either origin stories, like a creation myth, or something like this. This story is partially responsible for explaining something that we know to be true about the world. So in this case, this is explaining why we have seasons, and you have different stories explaining these things in different cultures. So a fairy tale is a little bit different because that is concerning more the affairs of human beings, and this is a story about the gods, right? So we have a separation here because the gods are holding archetypal energy for all of culture and not just for their individual lives. So we've got something kind of grander and more serious going on here when we talk about gods, because they are holding archetypal energy. So should I explain about archetypes? Is that...
Well, absolutely. I would love for you to also explain, though, why does, because, kids and even adults, our initial thought when we learn something new is, why does it matter? So how does myth fit into our modern life? Why does it matter in relation to our modern life?
Well, I would say that what myth has to offer is that there is this almost untapped repository of wisdom. So if we're religious, if you're a Christian or a Jew or a Hindu or whatever, you have sacred texts that you read as part of your religion, and these are the sacred texts of people, of cultures that may no longer be in our world in the same way, but it still has wisdom in it. So what we can do is we have access to the wisdom of our earlier ancestors, and we can go into that and say, okay, this has things to teach me. And when we get to it a little bit later, I've got some insights around creativity specifically and how we can enhance our creative lives by looking at myth. But myth is much more than that. It's not just about creativity. It's about looking at our lives through a different kind of mythic lens. And it has access it allows us to access things that we may not necessarily have looked at in that way. So it gives you a different perspective on concerns that you may still have. And what it offers is that you can read a myth, and it may not necessarily present itself with its wisdom at first, but if you can sit with it for a while, it will ultimately teach you things, have things to teach you. And that's part of what I do as a mythologist, is I help guide people through that process.
Well, before we talk more about the creativity and how myth can impact our creativity, you work with all age groups.
I do.
So how young is too young to start teaching children about myths, and what are some of the things that you teach the younger kids?
Okay. Well, right now we've just started a new company called Mythic Stories Education, and we're bringing mythology into elementary schools specifically right now. And we've got kids in that class that are anywhere from age 5 to about 10 years old. And I've taught all the way up into adulthood. So I've seen basically the entire range of kids from age 4 or so all the way up to adults. So when you're 4 or 5, all that you really care about is the story. And that is the one thing that's great about myth, is that it's got a great story to tell, and you can tell it, and the kids get really excited about just hearing the story. And they may not understand necessarily what it is that the myth has to offer kind of underneath the surface. But then as you start to get older and the kids are developing better critical thinking skills and this kind of thing, myth has a lot to offer because it is developing that. And when I teach kids these stories, what I try to do is say, okay, well, this is what's going on the surface. And the kids always want to say, well, what if that person did this instead? Or what if they tried this? And well, this is the story in the way that it's written, and we have to kind of look at it in the way that it's presenting itself, because it has something to teach us the way that it is. For example, a year or so ago, I was teaching an online class about Sisyphus, and he's the guy who rolls the rock up the hill. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he angered the gods. So his punishment was in the underworld is he had to roll this enormous boulder up a hill, and then he'd have a second to rest, and then it would roll back down, and his job would be to push it up the hill again. So this is his eternal punishment, and that's why we have this word that things are a Sisyphean task, because it's so hard and it's kind of never ending. And they were really interested in trying to think of ways to make things easier for Sisyphus. So they would say, well, what if he chipped the rock smaller, somehow, or what if he, tried to get help, or what if he did this or that? And that's very literal thinking, which is really typical for kids. But what I am trying to do with education of kids with myth is, by looking at the story metaphorically, you can start to get the lesson out of it, and it teaches children really good critical thinking skills. So if they can acquire the ability to look at things metaphorically and not literally, it helps them as they move on into their life to look at not literalize everything that they see. So what I did was I said, okay, well, this is Sisyphus, and if he was going to chip the rock smaller, you might say that that's like not studying as hard for your exams and only getting a C instead of an A. But if you're pushing the rock up the hill at its full weight, then it's doing the work that it takes to get the A. And then they start to get it, and then they start to look, as we go on with studying myth, they start to see how things are not literal and how you can see the metaphor in the myth. And that's what I'm after with all of the education initiatives that I'm working on, is I want to get kids there so they've got those critical thinking skills going into life, which are really important. So
I
I think
totally
Myth has a lot
agree.
to offer for that.
I totally agree. Myth is, as I'm learning, I mean, just in this brief amount of time that so far we've had, I am learning a lot, and
Good.
I'm super excited. Before we take a quick break, though, I would love for you to just share how people can reach you, especially educators and people who would like to bring you into the classroom.
Well, my website for most of my work is mythicstories.com. And if you Google my name, Allison Stieger, you will find it. And our education company is called Mythic Stories Education, and our website for that is mythcamp.com. So if you want to find out about our teachers and about our classes and our curriculum, you can learn more about it on mythcamp.com.
Absolutely wonderful. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be talking more with Allison Stieger. So stay tuned. This is Coffee and Coaching with Caryn, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Stay tuned. Coffee and Coaching with Caryn will be back after these messages.
Need a little more happiness in your life? Here you go. The Happiness Recipe Podcast to the rescue. Listen each week as June Klein and Sandy Weaver Carmen share wit, wisdom, and wonderful food with their guests. Guaranteed to add happiness to your life. happinessrecipe.net.
Yo, attention authors, share your work on Coffee and Book Chat. Book reviews, author interviews, blog posts all about you and your book. Visit coffeeandcoachingradio.com for details today.
Are you looking for quality entertainment and activities for the entire family? Then come on down to the Plaza Theater Company and Plaza Academy Dance Studio, located in Cleburne, Texas. The Plaza Theater Company is an award-winning community theater that presents 10 productions a year, performing every single weekend. If you have a child that enjoys acting, dancing, or singing, then you can enroll them in the Plaza Academy Dance Studio. For more information, visit plaza-theater.com or call 817-202-0600.
Welcome to Coffee and Coaching with Caryn. Grab your favorite mug, sit back, and enjoy. Now here's your host, Caryn Fitzgerald.
Hello there, this is Caryn Fitzgerald, and you are listening to Coffee and Coaching with Caryn, and my guest today is Allison Stieger, and Allison is a mythologist, an author, a lecturer, and a workshop leader. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Definitely need to check out her website at mythicstories.com, and you can learn more about her and all the fun stuff she's doing. And we're going to talk some more with Allison. Allison, are you still here with us?
Yes, I am.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I would love to talk now about, you mentioned that myth impacts creativity. It has something to do with creativity. So I would love to hear more about that association and how you make that connection.
Well, the primary work that I've been doing with myth over the last couple of years has been reading myths from all over the world, thousands of myths, just looking for insights that I can find that will be helpful for people that are working creatively. And there is so much great stuff out there. I've been having the best time with it. And so what I would like to do today is just share one story, one myth about a goddess from Mesopotamia named Inanna, and I believe that she has a really wonderful lesson to teach us about what we can do as creative people to make sure that our work is being impactful and resonant with the people that are consuming it. So if you can be a writer or an artist or a choreographer or just doing any kind of creative endeavor, and what we're trying to do as artists and people that are creating any kind of art is we want that work to be meaningful to the people that are looking at it or reading it or watching it or whatever, right?
Absolutely.
So, and I think that that's really true for not just people that are in the arts, but anyone you want, as a radio host, you want to be impactful and resonant for the people that are listening to your show. So this has a really beautiful lesson for anyone who wants to bring something new into the world. And it doesn't have to be something in the arts. You can be an insurance agent and you want to bring a new procedure into your office, and you want that to be impactful and resonant to the people that are going to use it. So I think this is a lesson that is really applicable to anyone. And the story of Inanna has this really beautiful little image in it, kind of deep in the heart of the story, that I think is really useful to us as anyone who wants to bring something new out into the world, which I think is a really wonderful human instinct to try to do. So let me just tell you a little bit about her story, and then I'll talk about what the metaphor is in this particular myth.
Perfect. Absolutely.
Okay. So Inanna was the goddess. She's called the Queen of Heaven and Earth, and she is a goddess from Mesopotamia, which is now kind of in the Middle East around Iran. And she was a goddess of love and fertility and even war. But she's got this one story. Now, these are some of the most ancient myths that we have a record of. They were written on clay tablets in the Middle East back in the 1920s, and they were translated. So we've got this kind of direct through line back into that time that is beautiful, and we don't have a lot of people interpreting it along the way and then losing the meaning. So she has decided, this is Inanna, and she's a goddess of love and light and all things that are bright and beautiful. And her sister's name is Ereshkigal, and Ereshkigal is the goddess of the underworld. And Inanna decides that she's going to go down into the underworld to visit her sister. Now, this is not something that is very easily done, and we have a lot of myths about people descending into the underworld and then trying to come back up, heroes and gods and all of this. Well, she decides that she's going to make this descent. So she knows that she might not come back, though, because it's very easy to get into the underworld, and it's very difficult to get back out, as we saw with Persephone a moment ago. So she decides that she wants to do this. So she puts on her robes and her makeup and her jewelry, and she holds her scepter, and she's got all of this accoutrement that she's wearing. And these are all things that are emblematic of her power as a queen and as a goddess, right? She's got all this beautiful jewelry on. But before she goes, she tells her maidservant that I might not come back. So if I don't come back after 3 days, I want you to go to the king of the gods and tell him that I need help, and he will help you. So she starts to make this descent, and as she's going down into the underworld, she arrives at a gate, and there are 7 gates leading down into the underworld, and she's met there by the gatekeeper, and he says, well, you can't come down unless you give up something that you're wearing. So she gives up her lapis beads first, and then she goes down to the next gate, and she gives up one more thing of herself that she's wearing. And as she continues to make her descent into the underworld, she has to keep giving up all of the things that she's wearing. And these are all pieces of herself in a way. So she gets down there, and by the time she's gone through the 7th gate, she's completely naked and she has nothing left other than her own self. And she gets down to her sister, and her sister's not expecting her. And she's grieving because the reason that Inanna is visiting her is because her husband had been killed by Gilgamesh, which is another myth, the myth of Gilgamesh. And he's the bull, and he's been killed as a monster by Gilgamesh, and so she's grieving that death. And her sister Inanna arrives to Ereshkigal, and Ereshkigal sees her and immediately kills her, and Inanna drops dead. And now she's lost even her life. And what Ereshkigal does is she takes Inanna's body and she hangs it on a hook on the wall. So Inanna's dead, she's in the lowest part of the underworld, and her body's hanging on a meat hook. So then, after 3 days have gone by and she hasn't returned, the maidservant goes to the king of the gods, and she says, Inanna has not returned, we need your help. So the king of the gods he scrapes the dirt out from underneath his fingernails, which I think is a really interesting little detail, and he creates these little mannequins out of the dirt. And he gives them life, and he gives them the food of life and the water of life, and they descend down into the underworld. And they're able, because they're not really alive, they're able to slip past all of these gates, and they get down to the underworld where Ereshkigal is, and she's in the pangs of giving birth. And she's crying out, oh, my back. And they say, oh, your back. And she says, oh, my head. And they say, oh, your head. And she's so moved by their compassion for her suffering that she offers them anything that they want. And again, this is a common theme in myths, and usually the person who makes that offer ends up regretting it. And they ask, well, we would like that body that's hanging on the meat hook. And she says, what? You could have anything you want. I'll give you riches. I'll give you power. I'll give you anything you want. And they said, no, we want the body. So she finally acquiesces and gives them the body of Inanna, and they take the food of life and the water of life, and they sprinkle it on her body, and she is able to return to life. And then she is able to reascend out of the underworld and has to find someone, though, because you can't just walk out of the underworld. She has to find someone to replace herself. So she goes out into the world, and she sees her maidservant who is properly grieving her, and she says, well, we can't take her because she's grieving properly. And they go through several people that are actually grieving her death, and then they finally get to her husband, Dumuzi, and he is laying under a tree, strumming his little guitar, having a grand time with the milkmaids, and she says, okay, you can take him. So then the spirits of the underworld go chasing after Dumuzi, and then we get into a different myth. But what interests me about this particular story is that moment at the very bottom of the underworld in which Inanna is hanging on the meat hook. Now, I don't know if probably most of your listeners have never been in a slaughterhouse or been around any kind of cattle or whatever that have been butchered, but I used to see this a lot. My dad hunted, and he would hunt for caribou and moose in Alaska where I grew up, and he would hang them on meat hooks in our garage. And the point of hanging something on a meat hook is that you want to drain the fluids out of the body. right? That's a way to like prepare the meat before you're going to eat it.
Okay.
So what occurs to me here in this part of the story is that even after she's given up all of this accoutrement of who she is, all of her power, she's gone through all these 7 gates, she got down there, she still has her life, and she loses her life as well. But she is still not done. She is still not done giving of herself, even though she's died, and that's all that there is left. She has to, the deepest part of herself has to drain into the deepest part of the underworld before she can return and make her spree ascension. So what this tells me about our creative life, we have to, in a way, as creative people, if we're going to bring something to the world, we have to make an internal descent. We have to go down into our unconscious mind as much as we can. We have to sort of sink into our creative energy, which is kind of down low, and we have to let ourselves sink into that, and we have to be willing to give up some of these self-identifiers that we think of as who we are in order to really bring back that great creative energy that we can find as we make that descent. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's an extremely powerful story. And as you were sharing that story, I have this visualization going on. I'm a very visual person, so as you're telling this story, I've just got these images in my head of her, descending and all the different things that you were describing, and it's fascinating, and it's just really wow. I'm going to ask you a question that I have, a thought on. I have my own answers on it, and I'd love to hear everyone else's thoughts and opinions and different viewpoints. Why does creativity matter?
Well, I believe that it matters because this is what you kind of alluded to at the beginning of our talk. We all have our own life experiences that we've gone through in life. And what I see sometimes with the people that I work with in my creativity workshops is there's so much fear and self-doubt around putting something out into the world. So people say, well, I'm not Shakespeare, or I'm not, fill in the name of your favorite writer or whatever. I'm not famous, I'm not Einstein, I'm not, so they compare themselves to people at absolutely the peak of their careers and the peak of culture, and they feel like they have nothing to offer. And to me, that is the greatest tragedy that I can ever imagine, because we all have a unique path through life, and you have something to offer that no one else in the history of the universe has. You have a unique perspective on the world, and if you don't bring that back out, then that is lost to all the rest of us forever. And I think that is the greatest tragedy, because people convince themselves that they don't have anything to offer to the rest of us, and that one special thing that they have, it gets lost. And I mean, to me, that is what drives the work that I do with creativity, because I see people and they're afraid, or they lack self-confidence or whatever, and what I like to do is say, you know what, you have something of value to offer. If you don't express that, not only are you going to be less happy, but the rest of us are going to lose out on that, and it's going to be gone. So that is part of what drives me. And I think that if we live creatively, what it does, I believe, is it moves energy through our lives. So if we just sit at home and we go to work and we just kind of pay our mortgage and do our thing, it kind of creates this stagnant quality, because there's nothing moving through us, if that makes sense. We need that movement. And I find this to be true, too. If I'm being creative and I'm working creatively in my life, I am much happier. My marriage is better. I'm a better mother. I'm a better friend. Everything in my life is better because I'm putting new things out into the world. And then that's the beauty of creativity, is that new things, new ideas come, and new things are created and to be brought forward. But you can't discover those new things unless you process that creativity through yourself.
Absolutely. That's exactly, I am right in line with everything you're sharing. And one of the things I love about creativity is I firmly believe that each individual person is given different ideas, different thoughts. And
absolutely,
the reason for these ideas and thoughts, though, we wouldn't be given them if we weren't meant to create something with this idea, and we weren't capable of creating using this idea. And I mean, there are times I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I sit straight up and I'm like, wow, I just had a great idea. And my husband will look at me and he's like, just write it down. We'll talk about it. It's still 3 a.m.
Exactly.
And so I do, and I write it down, and 3-4 hours later I wake up and I've got even more coming through me. And I find it fascinating when people do the 9 to 5 job and aren't creating anything. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having a job.
No.
But if that's the end all be all, and you go home at night and you eat dinner, watch TV, go to bed, repeat the next day, it's like a little piece of us dies every day, and it's a hard, challenging way to live life when being creative and having fun is so much more exciting. You never know what's going to happen.
Exactly. And sometimes you fail and sometimes you fall on your face, but that's okay because that's part of the process. And you're moving things into the world. And it's not always going to be great and it's not always going to be perfect. But it is so much better to do that than to live a life in fear.
Absolutely.
And you tell yourself with your internal critic, you're like, oh, I'm not good enough, or people are going to make fun of me. And that's true. And I do believe that we have people in our lives that are going to try to tear us down and are going to try to keep us from doing that. And that's done out of fear as well. Right?
Absolutely.
So,
And before
we
we
all
go,
have the responsibility to find people that are going to support that.
right, and before we go into that, because that's a whole other topic, we're going to take a quick break, and we will be back with Coffee and Coaching with Caryn. We're talking with Allison Stieger, and we are talking about Mythic Stories. Her website is mythicstories.com, and we will be back after these brief messages.
Stay tuned. Coffee and Coaching with Caryn will be back after these messages.
Hey Lily, do you have lines, wrinkles, or low energy?
Yeah, I do.
Well, change it all now. Look and feel younger from the comfort of your own home today.
How?
Visit 10yearsyounger.now.com for your free personal consultation.
Thanks, guys.
You're welcome.
Looking to monetize your passions? Ready to get paid for doing what you love? Contact Caryn at coffeeandcoachingradio@gmail.com and get creative strategies for developing income while doing what you love.
Dreaming of turning your book into an audiobook? Make it happen. More and more people are discovering the joy of audiobooks. They should be discovering you. Our professional personal service gives you just the audio product you've dreamed of. Check us out, voiceworkondemand.com.
Welcome to Coffee and Coaching with Caryn. Grab your favorite mug, sit back, and enjoy. Now here's your host, Caryn Fitzgerald.
Hello there. This morning we are here on Coffee and Coaching with Caryn, and we are talking with Allison Stieger, who is discussing myth with us and the importance of myth. Her website is mythicstories.com, and you can read all about her. And there's more detailed information there on Allison and all the work she's doing, so I suggest you check it out. Allison, I would love to talk with you more about your mission, because this is something that you are so passionate about.
Absolutely.
I would love to know, tell us more about your mission in regards to myth and creativity and bringing this all together.
Well, what I love to do more than anything is work with people on enhancing their own creative lives one-on-one. So I offer a creativity coaching service. I also lead retreats, and I have a series of lectures and workshops coming up that are scheduled around the United States over the next few months. And I just love to talk to people about the creative journeys that they're on, what they aspire to do, what their roadblocks have been. And there are always lessons that we have in myth that can lead us through and past every roadblock that there is. So we talk about your childhood and how it compares to what the creation myths of the world have to teach us, and we work through that, and we look at myths from Greece and Australia and Africa, and each one of those things, like the story of Inanna that I shared a moment ago, has more insight and things to teach us about working through our creative journey and anything that might be stopping you from doing the work that you need to do in the world. And that's what I'm trying to do. I want to bring people out to have them get past their fear and teach them how to engage with the world in a more profound way. So that's what I'm about. Everything that I do just about is in support of that. I'm writing a book about myth and creativity, so all of these stories and lessons will be in there, and the lecturing and the speaking, all of those things are in support of that. So,
in fact, well, as we're talking about the lecturing and the speaking and the different programs, tell us a little more detail about the different offerings and the different programs so that people can connect with you and get a broader view of what you really are offering.
Well, what I have scheduled at the moment is I will be speaking at a series of Jung societies. And when I say Jung society, I mean a group in different cities that is dedicated to studying the work of Carl Jung, who's a psychologist from the last century. He was a protege of Freud's. And these groups exist to discuss Jung's work and to discuss issues around leading a more fulfilled life and what Jung called individuation. So that is the process of becoming a person who has figured out how to live better and become individuated, as we say in Jungian terms. So I've been invited to come in and speak at some different groups around the United States. There's a whole lecture schedule on my website, so I will be offering usually a Friday evening lecture around all the topics that we're talking about right now. And then what we do the next day on Saturday is we have a workshop in which we can work together to implement this in people's lives. So I've got a series of those. And if you're interested in coming to one and there's not one offered in your city, please just email me, and that will allow me to go to other organizations and say, there is some demand for this here. Can we set up something? So don't be discouraged if there's not one in your area you would like to hear me speak. Let me know that, and I can use that to try to help schedule something else. So.
Oh, wonderful.
And if there's not, still, if you live in Antarctica or whatever, and there's no way to get to a lecture, I also offer creativity coaching. So I'm able to work with people one-on-one who would like to do this with me personally but don't, for whatever reason, have access to a workshop or a retreat. So that is available to anyone who is interested in that as well.
So there's no excuse.
There's absolutely no excuse. There's plenty of ways to get in touch with me. They're all over my website. My email address is allison@mythicstories.com. I welcome email from anyone who might be interested in the work and might be interested in working with me more deeply on it.
Well, before we let you go, I have one more question.
Okay.
And this is a big one.
Okay.
How can understanding myth help with life at work and at home? How can it help us?
Well, that is a big question, and maybe not answerable in just a few moments. But I would say that if you trust myth, and if you don't want to go to work with someone like me, a mythologist, you can always go and read myth yourself. And what I would encourage you to do, if you want to, is find a myth that you enjoy, find a culture that you enjoy. If you're interested in, say, if you're a big fan of Frozen and you want to read the Norse myth, go and get some of those books and read them, and just let yourself sit with that material for a moment, and it will present itself to you. It will happen, and it will happen in a way that's different than the way that it happens for me. So I would encourage people, no matter what you do, even if you don't come to any of my workshops or do anything, read my book or whatever, go and read some myths, and you will find things in them that you need. So.
And are there books that, as a parent, you recommend for kids, that parents can start reading myths to their children? Are there anything?
Well, there are many wonderful books about myth. One of the things that is helping our company get started as we go out and bring myth education to the world is there's a guy named Rick Riordan who writes about a character named Percy Jackson, and these have been very popular series of kids' adventure stories about demigods, which is a person who's a half mortal and half god. And he's got a whole series of them. He wrote about the Greeks. He wrote about the Greeks and Romans. He wrote about the Egyptians, and they're very popular. There's been a couple of films made about Percy Jackson, and he also has a new series out. He has Percy Jackson's Greek Gods, which is a wonderful book. It's absolutely hysterical, of Percy Jackson in the voice of the character of Percy Jackson describing all the Greek gods. So that would be a really fun place to start if you're interested. Look for Rick Riordan if you haven't already, but if you have a 11-year-old in your house who's a reader, they probably read him.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have been talking with Allison Stieger. Her website is mythicstories.com. You can learn a whole lot about her. And thank you so much, Allison, for being with us today, and we look forward to hearing more about the great things you're doing.
That was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Coffee and Coaching with Caryn.
Thank you so much for joining us. Tune in next time for more Coffee and Coaching with Caryn.
Until then, visit us at coffeeandcoachingradio.com.
Caryn Fitzgerald is an author, speaker, business strategist, and leadership coach. Connect with her at coffeeandcoachingradio.com.